Okay. I think now is a good time for us to start. So without further ado, I want to introduce Maureen Flatley. Maureen will be the moderator of today's panel. Maureen is an expert in child welfare and has been working in this space for decades. And I'll let her tell you a couple more sentences about herself before letting her introduce the rest of our panelists today. I'll be switching off my camera, but I'll be here in case there's any tech issues.
Thanks so much, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. We're here today to examine bills in Congress that attempt to address child exploitation. As by way of introduction, my name is Maureen Flatley. As the daughter of an FBI agent, I appreciate better than most people the challenges that child exploitation presents both to law enforcement as well as to victims. My dad spent most of his career detailed to the Senate Racketeering Committee working on organized crime. And so from an early age, I grew up looking at the difficulties of attacking global criminal enterprises with policy development. I've spent most of my career trying to apply those lessons to problems involving children. We all want to protect kids, but the question is, what is the best way to do that? And as busy staffers and interested parties on the outside, I know many of you have heard of the Earn It Act, but there are other bills in Congress that also address this issue and in some ways provide more focused responses when it comes to preventing the victimization of children and helping victims get past those experiences. Today, our panel will illuminate some of these bills and provide some perspective on other vehicles and their own experiences. And in particular, we want to talk about Senator Rod Wyden's Invest in Child Safety Act, which I certainly feel is a superb response to a complicated problem and one that we should be discussing in far greater detail and with more enthusiasm. First, I'd like to introduce our panel, Andrew Zak, who is a former Senate staffer to Senator Ed Markey, now the policy director for the Family Online Safety Institute. Agatha Tomasic is the executive director of Stop Child Predators. And my dear friend Diane Sachs is an expert in encryption and identity theft protection, especially regarding children. We'll begin with Andrew, who will give us an overview of some of the current legislation and policy development in this space. Andrew?
Excellent. Thanks, Mo. And thank you so much for having me here today. As Mo mentioned, my name is Andrew Zak, and we worked together throughout my 5 years in Senator Markey's office, where I worked on mostly domestic policies, including education and child welfare. I'm here today as the policy manager of the Family Online Safety Institute, or FOSI. We are an international nonprofit that works to make the online world safer for kids and their families. FOSI works to promote online safety around the world through enlightened public policy, industry best practices, and good digital parenting. We are nonpartisan and ensure our work is evidence-based as we avoid fear-based messaging. Instead, we believe it is possible to acknowledge the risks, mitigate the harms, and reap the rewards of living our best digital lives. Child sexual abuse, exploitation, and the online distribution of any related material is absolutely abhorrent and one of the worst crimes imaginable. In recent years, technology companies have reported a staggering number of child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. In reaction, there have been multiple bills introduced in Congress that attempt to stop the creation and dissemination of abuse and exploitation. FOSI has endorsed one of these bills, Senator Wyden's Invest in Child Safety Act. This is noteworthy because we don't endorse legislation lightly and have only endorsed 2 bills over the past 3 years. However, the Invest in Child Safety Act is a strong bill that would have an immediate impact on stopping child sexual abuse and the spread of related materials online. The bill would specifically provide agencies who are already fighting the root causes of CSAM proliferation significantly more resources to help their work. $5 billion in funding over 10 years would be directed to the investigations, prevention, and support for CSAM victims. This funding would increase investigative capacity for enforcement agencies through both resources and personnel, including at the DOJ, FBI, ICAC task forces, and NCMEC. The bill establishes a new office within the Executive Office of the President, and it gives funding and resources to the support of victims and child sexual abuse. And it also extends how long tech companies hold evidence of CSAM, which aids law enforcement agencies and prosecutors. We strongly support the Invest in Child Safety Act. The Earn It Act, meanwhile, focuses on taking away Section 230 to force companies to act in a certain way. We believe that Section 230 is a very important part of the debate about how platforms and any online service should moderate content. We also believe the statute is not necessarily untouchable. However, if Congress does decide to amend 230, it should be narrowly focused on content moderation considerations and not applied more broadly as an answer to other problems. Amending Section 230 or threatening to is not an appropriate action for Congress to take in areas beyond legislation focused on content moderation or platform self-governance. Additionally, there are other bills that Congress is considering that would have significant effects on kids' online safety. In the privacy space, there is COPPA 2.0 and the Kids Privacy Act. For safety and harmful content, there is the Kids Online Safety Act and the Kids Internet Design and Safety Act. There are also bills to increase platforms' transparency and reporting requirements, and bills to improve enforcement through resources and personnel. Then there are also global and state efforts to improve kids' online safety, including the UK's Online Safety Bill and Age-Appropriate Design Code, which California is in the process of replicating, and the Digital Services Act in the EU. As a quick plug, FOSI is hosting a briefing on these global online safety activities next week that you are all invited to. Keeping kids safe online is incredibly important, and I'm glad that Congress is so interested in the subject. There are many ways to go about it, and when it comes to Csam and exploitation, the Invest in Child Safety Act will have an immediate, significant, positive effect. Thanks again, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Really helpful perspective. And now Agatha Tomasic is going to talk to us a little bit about the importance of investing in law enforcement in any response to child exploitation online. Agatha?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who is attending for your interest in today's panel. To my fellow panelists, our wonderful moderator, Maureen Flaherty, and of course, NetChoice for hosting today's conversation. My name is Agatha Tomasic, and I am the Executive Director of Stop Child Predators, which was founded in 2005 after the kidnapping of 9-year-old Jessica Lumsford in Florida. Jessica was abducted, raped, and murdered by a twice convicted sex offender. At that time, the average child molester spent only 3 years of a 7-year sentence in prison before being released back into society. For more than 15 years, we've convened policymakers, advocates, and law enforcement to protect children from predators, especially with rapidly changing technology, information access and exchange, and legal systems that can barely keep up with this incredibly dynamic environment. Under the leadership of Stacey Rumbanop and founder Carrie Katz, we crafted the Sexual Offenses Against Children Act, which mandates minimum 25-year prison sentences and lifetime electronic monitoring for adults convicted of lewd and lascivious acts against children under the age of 12. With this issue again at the forefront, we want to make sure that our communities are equipped to best protect our children. That means legislation that considers the complex web of technical, constitutional, and practical issues that could stand in the way. In our case, specifically giving law enforcement the supportive resources they need to best protect children, stop predators, and bring these offenders to justice as mandated by law. In this case, it'll mean policies that allow law enforcement to pursue these cases expeditiously and within the parameters of what the constitutional laws, specifically around the Fourth Amendment and right against illegal search and seizure. Staffing, again, so that these cases can be pursued expeditiously. And of course, with all of that comes funding. We just want to make sure that the implementation of policy isn't stalled because law enforcement lacks the resources it needs. Thank you again, and I look forward to any questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Agatha. I really appreciate it. And now Diane Sachs is going to talk about concerns that we have around the Earn It Act's attempts to weaken encryption and some of the unintended consequences that we're already seeing when it comes to exploiting children in other ways. Diane?
Thank you, Mo. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. I've been working with Maureen for about 3 years, focused on how to protect children from ID theft and exploitation, and specifically foster youth who are at an even greater risk for the damages that are caused by identity theft. So data privacy of minors, PII, has to be a priority. Weakening encryption opens the floodgates of an entirely different kind of child exploitation. And this has huge unintended consequences that can impact children for the rest of their lives. So minors are targets of identity theft because the bad actors know that their social security number is untouched and therefore their credit is squeaky clean. And it's squeaky clean because they're not credit active. So this gives the thieves a huge lag time in detection. And therefore it's years before fraud is ever discovered. And this just allows the thieves to, rack up debt and ruin a child's financial future. So it's important to understand that identity theft not only impacts a child for the rest of their life, but it infects their entire family. Parents end up spending thousands of dollars to fix problems, and it puts a tremendous amount of stress on the family as well. Because when a child's credit is ruined, it can prevent them from getting a student loan. It can prevent them from renting their first apartment. And by preventing a child from renting their first apartment, it could actually lead to homelessness. So the PII of a minor is a valuable commodity on the dark web as well. This is where cyber thieves hang out and they buy and sell information. So when the PII of a minor is sold over and over and over again, it makes it nearly impossible to get ahead of the fraud. So Javelin Strategy conducted a study this past year, and they found that 1 in 50 kids became a victim of identity theft in 2020, and 1 in 45 had their information stolen in a data breach. These numbers are actually far from accurate for the simple reason that most child ID fraud is not discovered until they become an adult and are credit active. So the numbers are actually much higher. Let's not forget that in 2017, over 150 million people had their information stolen in the Equifax breach. And we estimate that over 25 million children were part of that breach. So the thieves go where the personal data of children is stored in mass quantities. For instance, ransomware attacks is running rampant in school districts across the country. Not only is the data there, but the thieves know that schools don't have the financial resources or the IT staff to secure the data at the highest levels. So when this data is not encrypted or the encryption is weakened in any way, it's just a treasure trove for identity thieves. In 2021, there were approximately 1,200 schools ransomware attacks, exposing the personal information of well over 1 million kids. And just last month in New York City, I just want to mention that 820,000 current and former students had their information stolen in a breach due to a third party because they were using weak encryption protocols. So the unintended consequences of identity theft of children will follow them, could potentially follow them for the rest of their lives.
Thanks, Dee. Some of the things that we've discussed over the last couple of weeks around this, we talk about the scope of the problem. And when we look at the scope of child exploitation, it's obviously the numbers are staggering. We need to know a lot more about how it's happening so that we can prevent it. But while that is an issue that I think a lot of people think, well, that couldn't happen to my child, identity theft could happen to anybody's child. It is happening to anybody's child. Can you talk a little bit about the scope of the problem in terms of the general population?
Absolutely. So none of us are immune to identity theft. We all have a unique identity and a unique digital identity. But our unique identity is our social security number, our name, and our date of birth. And We all have one, and thieves across the country, actually across the globe, you have or don't have. It's all about the value of that social security number and the value that that has on the dark web. And whereas somebody like an adult value of a social security number might be a couple of dollars, the value of a child's social security number on the dark web is hundreds of dollars, for the reason that, as I mentioned, that information is just untouched. And so thieves are looking for the information of children, the PII, because they know the value that it has and that they're going to be able to use it for years, potentially 18 years until that child becomes an adult. So the effects are far reaching.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question, Mo?
I think so. I mean, I guess the bottom line is that as we seek to develop responses to the problem of online child exploitation, which is obviously a serious problem, we don't want to open the floodgates to a different kind of exploitation of kids that is potentially even more ubiquitous. And so therefore we have a bit of a dilemma when it comes to encryption. And I think it's one that we should perhaps know a little bit more about. Andrew, one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you is this issue of funding. And one of the things in EarnIt that I was concerned about, because obviously, it's an admirable effort to attempt to solve a complicated problem, but it really doesn't have any spending. And when we started looking at the various bills that were being introduced in Congress and saw Senator Wyden's bill, the thing that struck me about the Wyden bill was that it contained some very significant spending. And as you and I have seen for many years, whether we're looking at child welfare or child exploitation or education or a variety of other contexts involving children, funding and spending on those things has lagged far behind unmet need. So as far as I am concerned, one of the critical elements in combating child exploitation is funding law enforcement, because we know the FBI is working dramatically behind the 8 ball in terms of staffing levels and capabilities and having the resources that they need. It feels to me like the Wyden bill is really right-sizing that funding. And I just wondered, from your perspective, especially as a Hill staffer, how that feels to you, the importance of the spending.
Thanks. I agree with you. The amount of money and how it's proportioned out in the Invest in Child Safety Act is remarkable. $5 billion over 10 years. This is for all parts of it as well. This is for prevention efforts, training, teaching, the ICACs are throughout the country in terms of prevention in schools with families. This is to help active investigation. This is DOJ. This is the criminal division. This is the FBI. And it's money for victim support services, which is, as you know, incredibly rare and incredibly important. The actual kids are the victims here. And so focusing on what can help them short-term and long-term is incredibly important. And to mention NCMEC, NCMEC is overwhelmed. They need help in terms of these reports. They're getting tens of millions of these reports a year, and that's incredibly overwhelming. They testified before the Judiciary Committee how much they're doing and how much more help they need. This bill specifically gives them $150 million over 10 years for personnel and technological improvements as well. So this is a significant boost across the board.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we talked about this earlier, but I see a lot of parallels in efforts to develop policy around child exploitation with where child welfare was in terms of policy development 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. The Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was created in 1974, created the mandated reporting system, which is kind of in a way analogous to the cyber tip situation. And I know that what we've seen on the child welfare side is that you can have a lot of reports, but they're not all substantiated. And so when we look at the cyber tips, 99% of which actually come from the tech companies themselves, it seems really important to have a better understanding of how many of those are substantiated, where they come from. We also know that 94% of them or so are actually being referred abroad. So we're looking at this really as a global problem, and we can't probably really attack the domestic problem effectively until we understand and get our arms around the global side of the issue. So to your point, I think the funding in this is really extraordinary in the sense that we're talking about 100 new FBI investigators, 65 new analysts at NCMEC. We have the lengthening of the evidentiary window for the FBI to work with, and also connecting that funding, not just at the federal level, at the state level. I know from working with victims myself that you said sort of have that, in a way, the potential for disconnect. And Agatha, this is where Stop Child Predators has been so important, because you guys for many, many years have encouraged that interagency communication, local, state, and federal, which is something that will only improve conditions for victims. Any thoughts on that, Agatha?
Well, I did want to kind of just piggyback on my earlier comments, and the comments just made that the funding for law enforcement and for organizations like NCMEC and others who are really a part of this effort, I mean, that's really going to play a big difference whether or not it's effective, or if it's just kind of talk that sounds good, right? I mean, or, you know, that comes with action rather. I think that's a better way of saying it, maybe. I guess, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think, you know, we talked about this yesterday a little bit. You know, clearly we want victims to have every avenue to justice that they can possibly have, criminal and civil. But I certainly feel in my own work in that regard, that having successful criminal prosecution is oftentimes the runway to having successful civil prosecution. So for instance, we have, I think, some concerns that there may be a compromise of the Fourth Amendment issues around Earn It. And from anything that has anything to do with compromising or potentially compromising the outcome of a criminal case is to be avoided at all costs.
Oh, absolutely. So a little bit onto that constitutional issue that I guess the Fourth Amendment touches. If agencies, conveners like NCMEC are, you know, they're working with the government, they're working, the tech companies are obviously collaborating with government as well. As you mentioned, the majority of reports are coming from the tech companies themselves. But as far as the incentive that government provides for them to kind of push these tips, like there is kind of a delicate area, because if it's pushed too hard, it becomes dismissible in court through the Fourth Amendment. But then you push it into the civil avenue, which is, you know, if the criminal outcome is one thing, then that'll determine the civil outcome that follows. Moving it from the criminal system to the court system, or the civil court system, also takes it out of the hands of the state, and kind of it could limit victims' access to that great continuum that the Invest in Child Safety Act kind of offers, whether it's just intervention through, I guess, victim services. So I think, again, it's just a complicated web of different things that need to be considered. And I do think that the Invest in Child Safety Act kind of hits on that really well.
Well, I think that to sort of follow on that, I think that when you look at bills in Congress, very often when an issue comes up and there are multiple bills, if one bill passes, even if it's not a complete response to the problem, it sort of eliminates any additional activity in that regard. Andrew, that's, I'm sure, been your experience on the Hill. Sort of the box gets checked and it's, you know, 10 years before the issue comes back up. And I think when we look at this issue from a strategic and from an operational perspective, we just cannot afford to detach the importance of supporting law enforcement, bolstering the criminal prosecution process, and carrying that forward to more support for victims in the criminal justice process and beyond, in terms of treating their trauma. So I think one of the concerns we've had about the way that the Earn It Act was being discussed and the kind of I don't want to say one-dimensional, but the way that it's been put forth as a solution is, it seems to me to skip a few things that need to happen as a part of the discussion. I think as far as the encryption piece of this is concerned, to Diane's point, these issues are not unrelated. When you start to talk about weakening encryption in one context, and the potential exists in a very real way to create other kinds of exploitation, that's a problem. That's a problem. I mean, we see bills that are passed involving kids all the time that have unintended consequences or are not implemented effectively. So I think part of what we wanted to accomplish today was simply to raise these issues as concerns in the context of a vibrant discussion around a variety of bills that are pending in Congress, to make sure that all of the considerations were taken under advisement and not just reacting to a handful of things that seem good and may be part of a longer term solution, but really don't get to some of the underlying issues. So that's something that I think we really have to continue to talk about. And so perhaps at this point, we'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other, are there any other particular concerns? I think that we've all covered the waterfront pretty well in terms of what the overall approach is to the bills that are pending. Andrew, any other thoughts in that regard?
I think you were right when you said, there are multiple bills competing about the same issue, and Congress won't pass multiple. They can be combined in certain instances, but they're not going to pass both the Earn It Act and the Invest in Child Safety Act. That would be astounding. So, my vote is for the Invest in Child Safety Act in terms of everything we already talked about, the money, the direction that it goes, the funding that it gives. And I don't think we even got too much into the efficiency and the streamlining of it, in that it establishes under one office, under one director in the executive office of the White House, the executive office of the president, one person to coordinate national efforts here, instead of a long commission that it's unclear exactly who would be represented there and what their best practices recommendations would be. Super broad, long-term, would take a while, versus appointing one person with Senate confirmation, ideally, is a lot faster and streamlined and more effective.
I'm glad you brought that up because, as you know, I am in general, from a philosophical perspective, not a fan of creating these kinds of commissions, because for sure, they take a long time to implement. It takes years to impanel these sort of appointed commissioners. And in my experience, they can become highly politicized. So when I look at the proposal around the commission, I totally get that the idea of it is admirable and well-intended and something that was meant to be useful. But much more useful, in my experience, has been to have an office in the White House. Because at that point, you appoint someone, you put them in the job, they start working, they get busy, and virtually any policy that flows out of the White House then in that space becomes filtered through this. So rather than having folks that may or may not be dialed into everything that's going on in terms of policy development, people who may have their own very particular political agenda, who may be on the left or on the right, who may not really be subject matter experts, but just sort of interested parties, suddenly everything starts to get bogged down. But when you put that White House office in place, it puts a whole new spin on things. It makes sure that that issue gets attention every single day, that when the White House puts forth their policy recommendations, that this is embedded in whatever it is, and not just in a narrow sense, but it can be more broadly across the board. So I think that that's a really, really important point to bring up. Can we talk a little bit, Andrew, about the whole issue of content moderation? Because one of the things that bothers me about Earn It from a child protection standpoint is that it feels like we're really conflating two different issues, and it's sort of a convenient convergence of interests, which is, of course, a standard Washington approach sometimes to, getting your ball across the goal line. But it concerns me that we would sort of have a twofer here of, sort of addressing content moderation at the same time conflating it with child welfare. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be able to better talk to the sort of litigious environment that this would create and future past attempts there with foster care and child welfare generally. But in terms of, I think content moderation, I mean, I'm not a privacy lawyer, so others might be better able to weigh in here, but it's been pretty clear that there has been a court expansion over the past 2.5 decades in terms of what Section 230 applies to, what it can protect, and what lawsuits are able to advance. Again, not a privacy lawyer here, and there are differing opinions on this, but it's pretty clear that the court's interpretation of what Section 230 does protect has advanced beyond congressional intent. So I think there is opportunity for Congress to weigh in on Section 230, but ultimately that's a user-generated content and platform moderation, content moderation area. So that's what it should focus on.
Yeah. Well, you brought up two of my favorite topics, and one of them is the whole issue of litigation around kids and what works and what doesn't work. And then I think Agatha also touched on something important in this regard, which is sort of the, keeping up with a dynamic and changing environment. And so, do we think that the majority of tech companies are harboring this material on purpose? Probably not. Some of them may have less moral high ground than others, but that's for another day. One thing that we've learned from child welfare in the last 50 or so years is that suing people institutionally is not necessarily a path to success. We know that since the early 1960s, every state child welfare agency in the country just about has been sued on behalf of kids in their care, either in terms of individual claims or class action suits. What we have seen is that litigation has, in some instances, the proceeds went to the kids, in class action suits less so. But what it hasn't done is improve the system. And what it has also done is diverted billions and billions of dollars in legal fees on all sides away from solutions in the system, away from making the system better. Certainly the adversarial nature of lawsuits actually prevents collaboration, prevents cooperation, and really keeps people from voluntarily adapting and adopting practices and policies that would protect children. So, you look at the child welfare system in America, and it's a hot mess 50 some years later. I know that some people differ in terms of the efficacy of lawsuits as a deterrent effect. And I know that there are some people who would love to move down this path for a variety of reasons. But at the end of the day, and there may be a place for it, but at the end of the day, sort of lumping all of this together in terms of the philosophical discussions around content moderation versus child protection seems ill-advised. And I think it's really two different sets of problems to address and to look at. And from the standpoint of working in a proactive way to encourage better and more effective outcomes for children sort of institutionally, while at the same time encouraging every possible path to justice, both criminal and civil, for victims seems really important. So, in 2005, when we discovered that the penalty to download a song was 3 times the penalty to download, the term of art at that time was child pornography, we wrote a bill and got it to be the same as downloading a song. I mean, we want to be proactive about giving victims every possible avenue to justice. And quite frankly, there is this need to create a meaningful system to hold the bad actors accountable. I think everyone on this call agrees that we don't want to create an environment where there are incentives to be careless and where there are incentives to be less than vigilant. But I think there are also a lot of precedents. And again, the child welfare mandated reporting system is a good example where, you create a system where certain people in certain categories have to report child abuse. So, you think about the litigation there and, would we want to lawsuits against every school teacher who didn't recognize every single instance of child abuse in their classroom? Yeah, Agatha, you.
I wanted to add a little bit to that and go back a little bit to my point of not moving things from the criminal to the civil, I guess, kind of sphere, or avoiding that. In many ways, you are putting the onus of pursuing justice onto the child and their family.
That's a really good point.
And I don't think that's the outcome that any party that's part of this conversation really ultimately wants. And there's, of course, the re-victimization and due to the lack of, confidentiality and all that, that I think trauma advocates would bring up as well. But I do think that the importance that children and their parents are the ones kind of pursuing justice once it moves from the criminal sphere into the civil sphere.
Yeah, you raise a really good point, which is that in some ways, and I don't think that this was intended, but I think it almost feels like EarnIt ignores the importance of criminal justice, which in my experience has been a runway to successful civil prosecution. And I think that really what we have here are really two issues. I get the frustration around the limitations of liability, but I don't think that simply attempting to remove the limitation of liability without having this other serious discussion of what does prevent child exploitation, it just doesn't make any sense. And I think, quite frankly, because the bill has been mired in some controversy, it has been preventing a real consensus-based discussion. And I think one thing I would hope that we could come away from this discussion with is a broader discussion that seeks to foster a discussion of how we get to the criminal justice piece, how we serve those victims in a meaningful way. I mean, the child advocacy centers are a tremendous resource, but they are incredibly underfunded. And I think that, the district attorneys really need to take a look at that seriously and how we can begin to do more and do better. I mean, I understand that victims and their families want to seek civil justice. I've been involved in that movement for literally decades, the Catholic Church abuse cases and others, and certainly working with kids in the child welfare system. The lawsuits never end. And I think while some individual claims have been very helpful for victims, the class action suits have been less so. I think that we also have an issue at DOJ where they've been collecting restitution for victims for years, or they need to collect the restitution from victims for years. And so I think you look at this and there are a lot of different moving parts. And so my major concern about EarnIt from the beginning has been that it looks like it addresses one piece of the problem almost at the tail end of the process, not to minimize what it's trying to accomplish, but in other words, you have a lot of steps if you're a victim. You have a lot of things to endure before you get to civil justice. You have the perpetration, you have the law enforcement response, you have the arrest, you have the conviction, you move through the process. And I personally just don't feel, in fact, I think it's verges on being irresponsible that we cannot call this any kind of meaningful response to child exploitation if we don't start at the beginning of the process, take that from day one, not take the onus off the perpetrators for 1 minute, keeping the pressure and the support on law enforcement. I watched my dad in the 1950s arrest mob guys and basically build the case of the Senate Racketeering Committee against La Cosa Nostra. I saw how complicated it was and I saw what it took, and that has informed everything I've done since then. And I think that in this case, unless we take this seriously, which includes the spending and the oversight and the accountability and the teamwork, and by teamwork, I mean the teamwork of everybody on this call, because I think that although we may have different views about the policy initiatives, I'm going to assume that we all agree that the victimization of children is horrendous, that we need to do better, that we need to do more, and we need to work together to get a result that doesn't just put a Band-Aid on it or fix one small piece of the system. Because you can have all the civil justice you want, and I am all about civil justice, but you can't have a good result if you ignore all the rest of this problem. Because for every child that seeks civil justice, you're going to have 10, 20, 100 new victims with no one else at the FBI to investigate the cases, no one else to coordinate law enforcement. I mean, just look at the ascendance of the cyber tips, and the reporting of cyber tips over the last couple of years has grown dramatically. NCMEC needs the resources to actually study that and know what it's about. I mean, what we know in child welfare is that when you look at a universe, I'll use Massachusetts as an example because that's where I live now, but you look at a universe of child abuse reporting, and how it looks if you have a state like Massachusetts has high reporting requirements. So it looks like Massachusetts has more child abuse. But then if you look at the substantiated cases, it's actually not that high, not as high as it looks. So we just need to know more about what's going on here. And we certainly know that if we're going to meet the moment, we need more FBI agents, we need more analysts, we need more local and municipal police response, we need more prosecutors, and we definitely need more judges that know what they're doing. So I think that these are all things that are important to any meaningful discussion. And someone comments, it's not a matter of choosing law enforcement over platform responsibility. Well, it is if we only pass one bill. So, that's the question here today is, what should the response be? We see this all the time where 5 or 6 or 10 different bills will be introduced on a particular topic. And some of them are good and some of them aren't. And sometimes what you do is you work together with the sponsors and you create a different response. So you put it all together in a new vehicle. In this case, I don't see how the Invest in Child Safety Act could be better thought out. I think it's almost jaw-dropping in terms of its vision and its boldness and its sort of systematic response to a really, really complicated problem. Diane, we've had a little bit of a question about if we can talk about a little more specifically about weakening encryption and why EARNIT's recommendations are potentially scary in that regard.
You're currently on mute, Diane.
Sorry. When you weaken encryption, you open the floodgate to access of PII. PII gets in the wrong hands. I mean, I'm the ID theft expert, and so I'm making what I'm talking about around identity theft and children, but I see firsthand what happens to kids when they are exploited in this way, and it's devastating. And so any type of weakening of encryption only has long-reaching negative impacts on children and their families, possibly for the rest of their life. And so there's no scenario that exists where weakening encryption and how that affects PII is a good thing or a way to move forward.
Thanks.
There are actually a couple different things from different parts of this conversation that I'd love to follow up on. Mo, your point on sort of higher reports, meaning that there's more of something, that's something I wanted to dive into, especially for any staffers on the call who have heard congressmen, senators talking about, look at how many reports this company has made, they're doing the right thing. That happened in a hearing on this bill. The simple number of reports and which platforms make the most reports to NCMEC is a misleading measurement of the problem. Each company handles their reports a little differently, and more numerically is not necessarily better or more helpful to law enforcement. The best tips and reports are those that are actionable. Reports of CSAM that have enough information so that the appropriate law enforcement agency can investigate, identify, and prosecute the abuser and or the main sharer of that CSAM are the most helpful types of reports because they lead to real action against the worst perpetrators. So I wanted to make that point for any staff on here, as well as you talked about the different steps of the CSAM report that it takes. This was actually, FOSI had a webinar 2 years ago now where we heard from Wyden's office, but then also heard from a tech platform. We heard from NCMEC and ICMEC representation. We heard from the DOJ and the DHS about exactly how this whole process works. So that was particularly enlightening. Encourage anyone to check it out on fosi.org. So it was great to actually follow the steps of a report and see how that works. We also got a question about age verification from an audience, which is an excellent question. And age verification for using services or platforms or apps is a really interesting and important part of the conversation in terms of what users and what age they are using sites and services. That is something FOSI is prioritizing this year, so there'll be some things to come on that. But in terms of active legislation right now, the age-appropriate design code is a very interesting model to improve online safety because the code requires websites, apps, and online services likely to be accessed by children, which is a very broad and inclusive standard, to consider the best interest of a child and incorporate safety by design. So right when that came into effect in the UK last year, multiple platforms updated their policies and design features, including limits on direct messaging. So when platforms restrict users under 18 for messaging people that they are not friends with, this can definitely cut down on grooming behaviors, ultimately leading to less CSAM being created and shared online. So there are multiple options of how we can attack this problem.
Great. We have a question about concerns about encryption being sort of hand-wavy and not really serious. And let me just respond to that, because there have been a lot of comments and a lot of assertions made on all sides of this about threats to encryption and security. And I think that what our goal is to be sure that whatever proposals are specifically advanced around encryption do not have these other unintended consequences. Certainly, having been in the space around other ways that kids are exploited for a long time, we know for sure that there are certain things that could happen to encryption that would be really bad, and really bad for kids in particular. I think that to assert that this is hand-wavy is perhaps not taking the conversation seriously enough. And again, we would want to have, first of all, I know that law enforcement would love to have weaker encryption. That's the world that I come from. And we love law enforcement, so we want to actually be helpful to them. But on the other side of this, we can't have any unintended consequences. So I think that what this is about is not being hand-wavy, but what it is about is being very specific. So perhaps that's a discussion that we can have in a different context. And quite frankly, we would like to probably have some additional roundtable discussions about certain elements of this conversation, because that's a perfect example of something that needs to be very, very concrete, and to be sure that we're not creating additional avenues whereby children can be put at great harm. And incidentally, identity theft often leads to the identity thief actually knowing exactly where the child is and victimizing them in other ways. So it's no small consideration. Any kind of child victimization is bad. And I think that for us not to raise the potential of this would have been actually irresponsible. So we look forward to having that conversation. And please rest assured that we are not being unreasonable at all. And we want to have a conversation that encompasses actual solutions from start to finish. We have the question, why can't we pass them both or pass them both together? Well, for one thing, I'm hoping that everybody on the thread who has been a fan of the Earn It Act will get off their computers and endorse the Invest in Child Safety Act immediately, because it's a tremendous response to this problem that should be non-controversial. The spending is offset. There is a tremendous and thoughtful response to a complicated problem that front loads the system with a lot of things that the Earn It Act doesn't do. I think obviously the Earn It Act has some elements that have been extremely controversial, but that's a conversation that we need to have and that we frankly welcome. And at that point, we would have, I think, a conversation that might be a little more in depth and more meaningful. And I will talk to you about the Earn It Act under a separate cover, and I look forward to having that conversation, although in its current form, I could not support it. And I see a question about the survivor provider benefits. I think that some of what you're talking about will come about from a different vehicle. I think that while Earn It does certain things, Invest does certain things, there's certain things that don't come into those committees of jurisdiction. And there are some pretty significant things in the works in Congress that would be, I think, extremely helpful and would have some real efficacy for victims, and we can talk about that offline. As far as the Earn It Act is concerned, I'm not going to support it in its current form for a variety of reasons, and that's a conversation we can have later, but I do think that we can have a meaningful conversation about the things that are not controversial and move those things along. Okay, well, I think we've had, if there are no more questions, I think our hour is just about up. And any other questions? Okay, Rob?
Thanks for that great discussion, guys. It was super interesting. I really, maybe I think one thing to touch on, just to your last point about passing them together, or maybe putting them part of one big package. From everything Maureen said, Senator Wyden's bill is not controversial. It directly goes to the problem and starts solving issues, compared to the Earn It Act, which has had a huge amount of negative feedback. There's been a huge amount of controversy. When it gets introduced, people are very, security experts are worried about encryption. People are worried about the Fourth Amendment and the impact it can have on the current reporting mechanism. Wyden's bill doesn't do that. So when it comes to, exploring and getting strong, solid options that bring a lot of people to the table, I think Senator Wyden's bill presents a real opportunity to do that in the way that the Earn It Act, given that it's, it's more about going after tech. It's more about making an enemy of the tech industry rather than really focusing on how we can all work together on solving this issue. Because I do think that addressing child exploitation online will need to be far more of a collaborative attempt rather than more of a, kind of a finger pointing, who can we blame for this kind of thing. So, I really appreciate all of the thoughts from everyone today. I think it's been really interesting, and I really hope to see Senator Wyden's bill pick up some new support among those that are, either supporting the Earn It Act or not. Because I really think that it is that uncontroversial as a proposal. But other than that, you can always reach out to me or anyone at NetChoice with questions. Thank you everyone for joining today. I really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you for moderating, Maureen. It's been great.
Thanks so much.